Hi, Jeff.
Coach, how are you?
I'm doing great. Yeah, thank you. How about you?
I'm great, thanks. I'm in my car and driving. I hope that's not inappropriate for us to chat.
No, no, not at all. Not at all. Um, so, yeah, again, thank you for taking some time to be able to speak with me and answer some questions that I have. And I'm really appreciative that you'd be willing to help out.
My pleasure. Anything I can help get you to graduation and get you where you need to be is my pleasure.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you again. So, in the email, I sent some of the questions that I was hoping to get to touch on. I don't know if you had a chance to look at those, but we're just gonna just jump straight into it if that's okay. If that's all right with you.
That sounds perfect. I like doing business, my friend. That works well.
Okay, good. So, in 2016, I think it was, or maybe it was the fall of 15, I went to a coach's clinic and I remember hearing you advocate for reverse linear periodization for distance runners. Um, and I'm curious to hear if that's something that, number one, if that's something that you have employed with some success with your athletes, and what compelling evidence you have to support that sort of periodization. And I guess just to make sure that I understand correctly, that's where, against a traditional approach to, I guess, the end point of the season, rather than diminishing the volume and increasing intensity, you diminish the intensity and continue to keep the volume high. Is that a pretty fair assessment of reverse linear periodization?
That is a fair characterization of that approach, sir. And my hope is that what I advocated for would be just an awareness of reverse linear periodization as a proposed resistance training model for endurance athletes. In other words, I have not utilized reverse linear periodization in endurance training per se, but in 2009, at a national meeting in the American College of Sports Medicine, at a keynote symposium, the chair of the symposium advocated that reverse linear periodization would present the next frontier in resistance training for endurance athletes. And he quoted a 2004 paper that put forth that argument based on data. So I hope I shared that, Coach, and that data set that he referred to is horrifically flawed, and that was not caught by the reviewers before that manuscript was approved for publication. So there are multiple flaws with that particular proposal. I wanted to bring it to the attention of the audience because I like to always be as comprehensive as I can and as evidence-based as possible. But my contention would be, sir, that reverse linear periodization is not the approach to use, whether it's for endurance training per se or for ancillary training, such as some form of resistance training. It's actually not the preferred model. Okay? At least I would say there's not compelling evidence that it's an optimal model or even an effective model. So hopefully that's a fair takeaway of the evidence, and I would leave you with that thought process to reflect upon.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's great. I mean, obviously, looking at some research as I've done with my program, sometimes poring over every detail of the methods or whatever, it's a time-consuming process, and I'm sure that there's lots of
Yes.
stuff that gets missed in that. Yeah. So.
Well, it shouldn't, though, Coach, in the sense that that paper was published in the journal Strength and Conditioning Research, if I recall correctly. And so there are three anonymous expert reviewers who look at those manuscripts that are submitted and make the eventual recommendations to the journal editor for he or she to consider in determining whether to accept or reject the manuscript. And so what happened was the authors of that paper, one of the authors asked me to look at it. Unfortunately, I already submitted it and had it accepted. And then I looked at it, and I looked at the data, and I went back and made the calculations, and their calculations were flawed. Their math was incorrect. So when that was presented years later at the American College of Sports Medicine in a keynote symposium, the chair of that symposium made the same mistake. He did not look at those data with a discerning eye. He just accepted the conclusion of the authors as opposed to looking at the data. And when I asked him about it after the symposium, he indicated that he hadn't looked at it at the level I had. So those data, Coach, do not make a compelling case. Now, I may have missed a recent data set because more of my current day endeavors are related to leadership, unfortunately. So I read less literature than I did, say, 3 to 5 years ago. But
Hmm.
I'm not aware of any compelling argument for reverse linear periodization. And certainly that paper, which is so often quoted, um, is not a compelling reference.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. So, I mean, would you say that that's probably something that will take a back seat unless it's unless it's reevaluated at some point down the road? And I mean, have a lot of people sort of I guess shelved the idea of periodizing training or resistance training specifically in that periodization model?
In that periodization model, I think that's your key qualifying statement, sir, because again, there's just not a robust evidentiary context for supporting reverse linear periodization. I think you can still make an argument for periodizing training, and I think you can still make an argument for resistance training. It might not be reverse periodized. It might be plyometric training. It might be some form of running specific resistance training, such as hill repetitions. I think you can make compelling cases for those two forms of training. But if you're going to quote unquote lift weights and do it in a reverse linear periodized manner, I don't know that you can make a compelling case for some incremental benefit to endurance performance.
Yeah. It seems to me like the key component to that might provide a benefit is just simply the fact that it like ends with a taper, so to speak, if you want to use that sense. I mean, ultimately, isn't that what it's essentially doing by diminishing the intensity, is kind of providing the athlete, a taper of sorts, you know?
Yes, sir. That's the intuitive or physiological appeal, if I can use that phrase, and that might lead to the hypothesis that reverse linear periodized resistance training could support enhanced endurance performance because it's consistent with a relatively high volume and a relatively moderated intensity. So yeah, it's not an unreasonable hypothesis to put forward. And so I think what happened is when the experimenters, when the scientists generated that initial data set that was shared in the 2004 paper, they were excited because their intuition was supposedly corroborated by the data. But it was actually the reverse linear periodized data that they calculated incorrectly.
Mm-hmm.
They
Yeah.
looked at the daily undulating periodized data and the linear periodized data. They made the correct calculations there. They missed on the other data, and
Yeah.
they didn't know that. Actually, they didn't know it until I told them.
Yeah. Or, then there's also this part of me that goes, I wonder if they did know it, and that's how you produce an exciting paper that gets published. You know what I'm saying? I
Well,
mean, there's a cynical aspect of that, but, I don't know. Who knows?
if they did, coach, if they did, there's a horrific ethical issue there,
Right.
and they should have retracted their paper. And I encouraged that, or at least I invited that because these are my friends. I mean, two of the four authors are good friends of mine.
Well, I hope I haven't offended. I hope I haven't offended you in
No,
that sense.
no,
Yeah.
not at all. I mean, I offended them myself when I told them their paper was flawed. Um, but I had an obligation because they asked me to review it,
Right.
even though I wasn't one of the formal reviewers. And once I saw the error, I said, "You guys need to retract this." But it was too late, if you will,
Yeah.
in terms of it had already been published. But you could still submit a retraction. So, to your point, that's the type of data set and the type of finding that would quote unquote make a splash. Your intuition is absolutely robust. However, the ethical responsibility of the scientist should override that if an error is detected, as it ultimately was.
Yeah, of course. Hey, speaking of tapering, one of the things I'd hope to ask you about was, tapering for distance athletes, and it seems to have this sort of mystery behind it, and I wonder if it's just because, you come to the end of a season, you've worked really hard toward an endpoint, and sometimes athletes perform really, really well when it matters most, and sometimes they don't, and there could be obviously a myriad of different things that cause, great performances and maybe poor ones when you reach that peak. And so it seems like a lot of coaches that I've spoken with have kind of said, gosh, the taper is something that sometimes eludes us. Some kids respond really well to it. Some kids don't. We wonder, like, did this athlete need more rest and recovery? Did this athlete need less of it? Did the taper actually get into their head in a sense? My question for you then would be, what would you say are some of the common misunderstandings, sort of like the foundational underlying principles that go into a taper that might be commonly misunderstood and therefore produce some possible mistakes that coaches often make with regard to tapering their athletes?
When I hear the word taper, coach, I think of reduction. And so when I think of operationalizing a taper, I think about reducing frequency or intensity or duration, what you and I might call volume. I think about reducing one or some combination of those to elicit a reduced training load and a more robust physiological and psychological state. Right? That's in concept. Okay.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So the biggest flaw that I think I see in practice, coach, and there's not a robust or an extensive or a rigorous database to support this, but anecdotally, what I think I've seen over the years, what I think has been increasingly recognized by elite high school coaches, is that what you should not reduce is intensity. What you reduce is volume. And you don't reduce volume by 50 or 70 or 90%. In other words, some of the traditional literature in swim training, where swimmers would undergo these draconian volume reductions on the order of 60 to 90%, I don't think that extrapolates to running or endurance running. So the largest or the most prominent mistake I think I've observed is a significant reduction in volume. I go back to a foundational principle of training and a acronym which has guided me well, and I'm not a tremendous fan of acronyms, but the principle is the principle of specificity, and I think that is the defining principle of all training. The most important among all training principles, I would put it at the top of a hierarchy. And the acronym I invoke is one you've undoubtedly heard. It's simply SAID, or SAID, Specific Adaptation to Imposed Demand.
Mm-hmm.
The system adapts to the demand that's imposed upon it. And when you change that demand suddenly and dramatically, the system will change. In other words, it will detrain. So I think what's been shown now over 30 plus years of experimental literature is you can reduce volume, but you must maintain intensity. And if you maintain intensity, then, for example, VO2 max, I'll take one metric or one measure. VO2 max, or maximum aerobic capacity, can be sustained at a reduced volume but unchanged intensity for a significant period of time. If you look back at some of the classic literature in the early 1980s, training volume could be reduced for as long as 15 weeks. If intensity wasn't compromised, and you had a group of subjects with VO2 max values plus or minus 55 to 60, then VO2 max wouldn't fall for 15 weeks. So again, maintain intensity. Doesn't have to increase when one's tapering, but I think one of the key principles for successful tapering is maintain intensity. I think one of the key mistakes anecdotally is to significantly diminish volume. And so those are two principles that have always guided me when I think about trying to place athletes in a position to run their best at the end of a season. And then the last point is the point you raised. I think there probably is an individual component to tapering. And so when we think about intensity and frequency in particular, that's where the science meets art, right? That's where you know an athlete who maybe is younger, maybe very, very good, but younger, a very accomplished sophomore, for example. Maybe that sophomore needs a little less volume than we might otherwise prescribe because he or she is simply younger as a distance runner. So a little more significant volume reduction is okay in that case. Maybe with a senior who has had 4 years of accumulated work, maybe he or she doesn't need a significant volume reduction because they are so, quote unquote, chronically exposed to the training process through an almost 200 plus week high school experience.
Yeah, so the volume stressor isn't stressing the body nearly as much because they've had such a prolonged exposure to the stress.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So in our program, coach, we'll cut volume by 20, maybe at most 25% in the last 10 days, but we won't change intensity at all. We won't run harder. We won't run slower. We won't change intensity. We'll just try to maintain an existing adaptation because we recognize in that last 7 to 10 days, fitness is not going to be enhanced, right?
Right.
A 9, 12, 3,200 meter performer does not become a 9-minute, 3,200 meter performer in the last 10 days of a season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Not physiologically, at least. Okay.
Right. Any benefit that they're going to get is going to come from the reduced stress, not any
Right.
not any new adaptation in that at that point.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
That's well said, right? So, in other words, in a sense, you're making fewer withdrawals than making more deposits by analogy in that last part of the season by providing some additional volume reduction.
Hmm. Coach, let's talk a little bit about resistance training. And I know that, in the programs that you and I have worked with, I think that we've had other strength and conditioning coaches who have taken on the majority of that component to an athlete's training at the schools where we worked. Is that?
Uh-huh.
And but just in general, we know that resistance training is an important element in a distance runner's overall training programming. But as coaches, we sometimes lack the knowledge and skills in a weight room to be able to do, exactly what we need for an athlete. And so, in your opinion, for distance coaches, what are some of the common misunderstandings that lead to mistakes that are made with regard to resistance training for distance athletes? Can you speak to that, like in terms of just your observations, your experience?
I can attempt to speak to that. I think the mistake that I've most commonly noted as I interact at clinics where I might be a clinician or presenter, the mistake I most commonly note is the mistake in which, as per our early conversation, there may be a general belief that low intensity, high volume resistance training automatically reconciles well with what endurance running is. And so if I just do a lot at a light weight, it's going to help me be a better runner. And so I don't think that's the case. I think the data actually makes the case for a different approach, Coach. First of all, I go back to plyometrics, right? There is now almost 2 decades of consistent data suggesting that one form of resistance training that is appropriate and beneficial for endurance athletes is that which is known as plyometric training. So definitely use that, right? Definitely incorporate plyometric training. Now, make it age appropriate, right? Make it age appropriate. Use very simple plyometric movements with, for example, high school athletes. But incorporate it, be consistent with it, do it 2, at most 3 days a week, and make it a part of your ancillary or resistance training. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other issue that I think about when I think about resistance training is specificity, and you heard me use that term previously, right? Specificity. So what's the most specific form of resistance training that I know of for a runner? Well, one such example would be hill repetitions. First of all, you're actually running, and number 2, it's resistant running. So that, to me, perfectly embodies the idea of specificity. And I'm not talking about hill repetitions because I'm in the sport of cross country. I'm talking about hill repetitions in whatever form it's manifest for distance runners in cross country, distance runners in track and field. If you believe resistance training is important for endurance athletes, then I think hill repetitions in whatever form you manifest needs to be a component of what you do. As far as the weight room goes per se, Coach, again, I think what we've learned, or what we're continuing to learn, is that an emphasis on power is critical for endurance athletes. Now, our sport's about aerobic power. Almost every sport I know about, at least with regard to success in separating winners from non-winners, is about mass-specific power output. So when I think about a young person in a weight room, I think about power, or in other words, a force velocity product. It's not about just lifting a lot, i.e. generating force. It's about being able to move a resistance relatively rapidly, i.e. generating a high force velocity product to generate a high power output. And doing that in what is hopefully a movement pattern specific approach, i.e. the movements I undertake in a weight room hopefully mimic the movements that are inherent in the act of running. So that's the way I think about resistance training as it applies to endurance running and endurance performance.
Yeah, so a lot of the athletes that go through the strength and conditioning program at the school where I work, and probably at many, many other schools, are going to be doing like a bilateral back squat, for example. And so if I'm understanding you correctly, one sort of application of your specificity that you're describing for a weight room setting might just be simply, let's figure out how to make this unilateral, just to get them on one leg, and let's see them perform that unilateral squat motion with as much velocity specific is specific to the velocity that they would perform that motion while running. So an explosive single leg squat where they're moving their body in a way that looks like running, essentially, right?
Yeah, that'd be a great example, Coach. And if there's a concern about the complexity of the squat or the foundational strength level of the student athlete, just initiate from a bilateral position and finish with a unilateral position. And again, try to be relatively explosive. So start on two legs, if you will, and finish on one leg. And incorporate, therefore, secondary muscles that provide stabilization. But again, velocity specificity, movement pattern specificity, those contributors that we have good evidence for enhancing athletic performance. Movement pattern specificity, velocity specificity of movement.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a great example, Coach. That's a really good example. And you've probably seen that if you've watched some of the video on Galen Rupp, for example, right?
Yes.
He'll go through a basic squat, but always finish on one leg, and always finish with the alternate leg elevated as he would when he goes through, for example, his gait pattern as a runner.
Mm-hmm. Right, finishing in sort of like a runner's position, so to speak.
Exactly, sir.
I think it was yesterday, a fella named John Marcus, who does a lot of work with Steve Magnus and coaches for High Performance West.
Yes, sir.
He tweeted something recently. He said, I believe that we coaches are teachers here to assist an athlete to best process and learn from failure as well as success. And he said, our most important hour is in the moments after a crushing defeat or a poor race. And I think about that, obviously this is steering a little bit away from physiology, which I know is your strong suit, kind of switching now into maybe psychology a little bit.
Yes, sir.
But in sport, as in most anything, athletes, people, we grow as a result of our failures. And so I'm curious to hear from you, what are some of the things that you think as coaches, just in general, are maybe some of the biggest misses that we make with regard to athletes encountering failure, and what are some sort of maybe guiding suggestions that you have for coaches in coaching athletes through those moments of failure and getting them to the other side where that growth really happens to be?
Coach, I think last summer, or last summer fall, I guess I would say, I think I presented 7 or 8 different clinics, if I recall correctly. And interestingly, at the majority of those clinics, that type of question in some variation came up, and that was very edifying or instructional for me. And so one of my core philosophies with high school student athletes is never yell, never demean, always teach. And so I'm glad to say I can't remember the last time I yelled at a student athlete. It may have been 6 or 8 years ago when one of my female student athletes put herself in unnecessary danger by running away from a group. So I raised my voice to emphasize the importance of her safety. Mm-hmm. But I try never to yell. I certainly never demean. I do not think that's effective to demean young individuals. Derogatory comments, the use of profanity in a sentence that's just not necessary. And then finally, to your initial point, we are teachers. We are teachers. These are student athletes. These are high schools. These are not professional organizations or professional entities. So I think it's incumbent upon us as a moral and ethical responsibility to be teachers. And experientially, I agree with you. We can be teachers at any moment, but perhaps our most impactful moments are when young learners are struggling the most, consequent to what they might perceive as a failure or a little less extremely an underperformance. So yes, I think that's a great opportunity to teach. And I think it's a great opportunity, for example, and more specifically, to build what I refer to as a relentless positivity. I think athletes are more successful when they're relentlessly positive. And while that might not be possible 100% of the time, I think to the extent that we try to infuse a belief system that is relentlessly positive, athletes are better prepared to handle the adversity that goes with our sport. I'm conjecturing that you'll agree with me that our sport is hard. It's difficult. And there will be setbacks. We saw Galen Rupp experience a setback not more than 6 to 8 weeks ago, and yet weeks later he ran just over 2:06 for a marathon after dropping out of a prior marathon.
Right.
So, again, he's a professional, not to draw a strict analogy, but again, I think the example of what we saw with Galen can extrapolate to how we go about trying to teach younger individuals. What is perceived as a failure is ultimately an opportunity for growth and success.
Perfect. Yeah. If you have time, I have one more question for you.
Of course.
So speaking of professional athletes, with the internet making it so available for brand new, distance runners who are passionate about their sport, kids can observe professionals doing what professionals are able to do, and I think that there can maybe be a temptation for athletes, but also for coaches who watch what professionals do to simply say, "Oh, here's what a professional is doing. They're performing very well. All I have to do is do what this professional happens to be doing." And so, ultimately, my question I have for you is, what sort of underlying principles should go into discerning the difference between what high level athletes and professional athletes do, and how to sort of I guess translate that to the appropriate level for a high school athlete, for example. So, like, ultimately, what differences should exist between what you see at maybe a very, very high level for a beginning athlete versus a very, very high level for not chronological age, but training age, someone who's been doing this for a long time. What are some of the things that we should expect to see as differences between the two that might guide our ability to discern the difference between what we see on the internet with pros and what's potentially happening in high school kids?
That's a great question. And I actually, for lack of more formal terminology, Coach, I took a stab at that about 6 years ago when I constructed a PowerPoint presentation on Alberto Salazar's approach to training in my very humble attempt to extrapolate that to an appropriate application for high school age student athletes. Interestingly, I found that presentation, which was mine. I actually found it up on the internet. Someone posted it up there eventually, and I was on an internet site, and I saw a reference to Alberto Salazar's training, and I thought to myself, I'm going to click on that link and learn about Alberto Salazar's training, and I clicked on that link and found my entire PowerPoint. So that was a reminder of how easy it is for information to reach the internet, for high school athletes to look at, for coaches to look at. And for me, what it comes back to, Coach, is this. Number one, what you seek when you look at those resources, whether you're a coach or a student athlete, if you're a coach or a student athlete who's a continuous learner and you want to benefit from the plethora of resources available on the internet, what you're looking for are training principles. Training principles. And I'll give you an example. What we should do that's different from professional athletes, I can also exemplify. So, for example, when I read about Alberto Salazar's training, and when I talked to some people who were somewhat close to Nike Oregon Project, and when I interacted with someone who was then a member of the Oregon Project, what I was looking for were principles. One thing I saw from Alberto Salazar was a relentless commitment to aerobic power development. I don't even say aerobic base training. I call it aerobic power development. And that's a principle, Coach, that can extrapolate through any age. I would argue a young middle school athlete, a young high school athlete should always focus on aerobic power development because that will sustain them both in the short term and in the long term. Now, the difference, or one difference between, for example, a high school student athlete and a Nike Oregon Project or professional athlete would, of course, be the volume, right? High school male might run 35 to 75 miles a week, depending on developmental level and musculoskeletal integrity. Whereas a Nike Oregon Project member might run 100 to 120, even 130 or more miles a week, depending on training history and musculoskeletal durability. So that's what I think is important. And when I'm asked that question, which I'm often not asked, I should say more often than not I'm not asked, but I appreciate you bringing it up because I think it's really critical because information is so readily available and so much of it's bad. So I look for training principles that can extrapolate across multiple age groups, across both genders, and do so in a manner that safely promotes short-term and long-term development of a distance athlete.
Yeah, I think that's great. There's part of me that thinks, maybe the typical history teacher who's thrown into cross country, hey, we need someone to coach these kids in the fall. You're the guy who goes online and okay, I'm going to learn everything that I can. Does that person necessarily have the ability to discern, the difference, like you're saying? And so I wonder how commonly even something like that happens. But I'm just kind of thinking out loud here.
That's a great question, and I can't answer that. In other words, I can speculate, and my speculation would be poor. It would be that anytime you bring someone in who has no background at all, such as that hypothetical history teacher who is just going to fill a role, keep young people safe, and earn a stipend, then there's probably a significant risk of that happening, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
By contrast, if you bring someone in who, perhaps like yourself, has a background in the sport, has also committed to a professional endeavor as a teacher, and can leverage his teaching endeavor to be a successful coach based on his athletic background and his passion for knowledge and his passion for endurance sport. That's a very different coaching candidate than that hypothetical history teacher who has no background and who's just thrust into that position because, for example, a school or administration or a school board or all the above really don't have a commitment to, for example, cross country, but do have a commitment, for example, to football.
Yeah, unfortunately, cross country doesn't bring in a lot of revenue for schools, does it?
Not to my knowledge, sir. Not to
No.
my knowledge.
No. Well, Coach, I really appreciate the time that you've dedicated to answering some questions for me. Through the years, I've learned a lot through listening to a couple of your presentations at clinics and even watching you coach from the sidelines. And so I'm really appreciative to have the opportunity to learn from you. And thanks again for your time.
Well, I appreciate it. I want to ask you before you go, if I may, very quickly, because I certainly have followed you and your program and the manner in which you've built the program so successfully and so impressively. Can I avail upon you sometime this summer after your academic endeavors are complete? Can I meet you for dinner and a beverage and buy you a meal and learn a little bit about what you've been doing specifically?
Coach, that would be an incredible honor for me. I even just having you ask the question is a great compliment to me. I'm very, very appreciative of that. Yeah, that sounds like something that I would very much enjoy. So yeah, that would be great. Like you said, I'm someone who is passionate about the sport and about high school kids and about seeing them grow and giving them cool opportunities to learn about themselves through the sport. And it was a passion of mine, like you said, like in high school and in college and beyond. And so it's been a lot of fun for me. And so the opportunity to surround myself with other people who have been there and done that and have been there and done that successfully, such as yourself, is that builds me up a lot. So I would very much look forward to that.
Well, leave it with me then. I'm going to follow up with you probably sometime in June once cross country gets underway informally or optionally. But I will follow up with you. I'll reach out to you and we'll find a date and time that's convenient for you. And we'll get together and we'll just talk training and enjoy the chance to hopefully help student athletes get even better.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Thanks, sir. You have a great evening.
You too. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, pal. Bye-bye.